Book 4. Beamtenherrschaft.
Well, Hoover performed. He would have fought. That was the point. He would have defied a few people. He would have scared them to death. He has a file on everybody. Richard Milhouse Nixon.
The 8th trip, or Hod. Telemachus sneezed.
There came unto the high chaparral one who had studied in the schools of the purple sage, and of the Hung Mung Tong, and of the Illuminati, and of the many other schools. And this one had found no peace yet. Yea, of the Discordians, and the teachers of Mumu, and of the Nazarene, and of the Buddha he had studied, and he had found no peace yet. And he spake to the high chaparral and said, Give me a sign that I may believe. And the high chaparral said unto him, Leave my presence, and seek ye the horizon, and the sign shall come unto you, and ye shall seek no more. And the man turned and sought of the horizon, but the high chaparral crept up behind him, and raised his foot, and did deliver a most puissant kick in the man's arse, which smarted much, and humiliated the seeker grievously. He who has eyes, let him read and understand. The Book of Grandmotherly Kindness. The Dishonest Book of Lies. By Mordecai Malagnatus, K.N.S.
The Starry Wisdom Church was not 00005's idea of a proper ecclesiastical shop by any means. The architecture was a shade too Gothic, the designs on the stained-glass windows a bit unpleasantly suggestive for a holy atmosphere.
My God, they must be bloody wogs,
he thought. And when he opened the door, the altar was lacking a proper crucifix. In fact, where the crucifix should have been, he found instead a design that was more than suggestive. It was, in his opinion, downright tasteless.
Not high church at all,
Chips decided. He advanced cautiously, although the building appeared deserted.
The pews seem designed for bloody reptiles,
he observed. A church, of course, should be uncomfortable. That was good for the soul. But this was, well, gross.
They probably advertise in the kink newspapers,
he reflected with distaste. The first stained-glass window was worse from inside than outside. He didn't know who St. Toad was, but if that mosaic with his name on it gave any idea of St. Toad's appearance and predilections, then, by God, no self-respecting Christian congregation would ever think of sanctifying him. The next feller, a Shoggoth, was even less appetizing. At least they had the common decency not to canonize him. A rat scurried out from between two pews and ran across the center aisle, right before Chips's feet.
Fair got on one's nerves, this place did.
Chips approached the pulpit and glanced up at the Bible. That was, at least, one civilized touch. Curious as to what text might have been preached last in this den of wogs, he scrambled up to the pulpit and scanned the open pages. To his consternation, it wasn't the Bible at all. A lot of bragging and bombast about some Yog-Sothoth,
probably a wog god,
who was both the gate and the guardian of the gate.
Absolute rubbish.
Chips hefted the enormous volume and turned it so he could read the spine.
Necronomicon, eh?
If his university Latin could be trusted, that was something like the Book of the Names of the Dead. Morbid, like the whole building. He approached the altar, refusing to look at the abominable design above it. Rust. Now what could one say of brutes who let their altar get rusty? He scraped with his thumbnail. The altar was marble, and marble doesn't rust. A decidedly unpleasant suspicion crossed his mind, and he tasted what his nail had lifted.
Blood. Fairly fresh blood. Not high church at all.
Chips approached the vestry and walked into a web.
Damn,
he muttered, hacking at it with his flashlight, and something fell on his shoulder. He brushed it off quickly and turned the light to the floor. It started to run up his trouser leg, and he brushed it off again, beginning to breathe heavily, and stepped on it hard. There was a satisfactory snapping sound, and he stomped again to be sure. When he removed his shoe and turned the light down again, it was dead.
A damned huge ugly brute of a spider. Black gods, Saint Toads, rats, mysterious and heathenish capitalised gates, that nasty-looking Shoggoth character, and now spiders. A buggering tarantula it looked like, in fact. Next, Count Dracula,
he thought grimly, testing the vestry door. It slid open smoothly, and he stepped back out of visible range, waiting a moment. They were either not at home or cool enough to allow him the next move. He stepped through the door and flashed his light around.
"Oh, God, no,"
he said.
"No, God, no."
"Goodbye, Mr. Chips,"
said St. Toad.
Did you ever take the Underground from Charing Cross to one of the suburbs? You know, that long ride without stops when you're totally in the dark and everything seems to be rushing by outside in the opposite direction. Relativity, the laboratory smock people called it. In fact, it was even more like going up a chimney than going forward in a tunnel, but it was like both at the same time, if you follow me. Relativity. A bitter-looking old man went by, dressed in turn-of-the-century Yankee clothing, muttering something about Carcosa. An antique Pontiac car followed him with 4 Italians in it, looking confused. It was slow enough for me to spot the year, definitely 1936, and even to read the license plates. Rhode Island AW 1472. Then a black man, not a Negro or a Wog, but a really truly black man without a face, and I'd hate to tell you what he had where the face should have been. All the while, there was this bleating or squealing that seemed to say, "Tequili Lee, Tequili Lee." Another man, English-looking but in early 19th century clothing. He looked my way, surprised, and said, "I only walked around the horses." I could sympathise. I only opened a bleeding door. A giant beetle, who looked at me more intelligently than any bug I ever saw before. He seemed to be going in a different direction, if there was direction in this place. A white-haired old man with startling blue eyes who shouted, "Roderick Usher!" as he flew by. Then a whole parade of pentagons and other mathematical shapes that seemed to be talking to each other in some language of the past or the future or wherever they called home. And by now, it wasn't so much like a tunnel or even a chimney, but a kind of roller coaster with dips and loops, but not the sort you find in a place like Brighton. I think I saw this kind of curve once on a blackboard, when a class in non-Euclidean geometry had used the room before my own class in Ingolstadt, Pope to Swinburne and Neo-Raff. Then I passed a Shoggoth, or it passed me, and let me say that their pictures simply do not do them justice. I am ready to go anywhere and confront any peril on HM service. But I pray to the Lord Harry I never have to get that close to one of those chaps again. Next came a jerk, or cusp is probably the word. I recognised something. Ingolstadt, the middle of the university. Then we were off again, but not for long. Another cusp. Stonehenge. A bunch of hooded people right out of a Yank movie about the KKK were busy with some gruesome mummery right in the centre of the stones, yelling ferociously about some ruddy goat with 1,000 young, and the stars were all wrong overhead. Well, you pick up your education where you can. Now I know, even if I can't tell any bloody academic how I know, that Stonehenge is much older than we think. Whiz, bang, we're off again. And now ships are floating by. Everything from old Yankee clippers to modern luxury liners, all of them signalling the old SOS semaphore desperately, and a bunch of airplanes following in their wake. I realised that part must be the Bermuda Triangle, and then it dawned on me that the turn-of-the-century Yank with the bitter face might be Ambrose Bierce. I still hadn't the foggiest who all those other chaps were. Then along came a girl, a dog, a lion, a tin man, and a scarecrow. A real puzzler, that. Was I visiting real places, or just places in people's minds, or was there a difference? When the mock turtle, the walrus, the carpenter, and another little girl came along, my faith in the difference began to crumble. Or did some of those writer blokes know how to tap into this alternate world, or fifth dimension, or whatever it was? The Shoggoth came by again, or was it his twin brother, and shouted, or should I say gibbered, Yog-Sothoth Neblod Zin, and I could tell that was something perfectly filthy by the tone of his voice. I mean, after all, I can take a queer proposition without biffing the offender on the nose. One must be cosmopolitan, you know. But I would vastly prefer to have such offers coming out of human mouths, or at the very least out of mouths rather than orifices that shouldn't properly be talking at all. But you would have to see a Shoggoth yourself, God forbid, to appreciate what I mean. The next stop was quite a refrigerator. Miles and miles of it, and that's where the creature who kept up that howling of Tequili-lee, Tequili-lee hung his hat, or its hat. I shan't attempt to do him or it justice. That Necronomicon said about Yog-Sothoth that Kadath in the cold waste hath known him, and now I realised that known was used in the biblical sense. I just hope he or it stays in the cold waste. You wouldn't want to meet him or it on the Strand at midday, believe me. His habits were even worse than his ancestry, and why he couldn't scrape off some of the seaweed and barnacles is beyond me. He was rather like Saint Toad in his notions of sartorial splendour and table etiquette, if you take my meaning. But I was off again. The curvature was getting sharper and the cusps more frequent. There was no mistaking the heads where I arrived next. Easter Island. I had a moment to reflect on how those heads resembled Tlaloc and the Loigor of Fernando Poo, and then this Kinks version of a cook's tour moved on, and there I was at the last stop. Damn, blast, and thunder, I said, looking at Manolete, turning his Veronica, and Concepcion lying there with her poor throat cut. Now that absolutely does tear it. I decided not to toddle over to the Starry Wisdom Church this time around. There is a limit, after all. Instead, I went out into Tequila Imota Street and approached the church, but kept my distance, trying to figure where bugger kept the time machine. While I was reflecting on that, I heard the first pistol shot. Then a volley. The next thing I knew, the whole population of Fernando Poo, Cubans descended from the prisoners shipped there when it was a penal colony in the 19th century, Spaniards from colonial days, blacks, wogs, and what-not, were on Tequila Imota Street, using up all the munitions they owned. It was the counter-coup, of course. The Captain Puta crowd who unseated Tequila Imota and prevented the nuclear war. But I didn't know that at the time, so I dashed into the nearest doorway and tried to duck the flying bullets, which were coming, mind you, as thick as the darling buds in May. It was hairy. And one Spanish bloke, gay as a tree full of parrots from his trot and his carriage, goes by, waving an old cutlass out of a book and shouting, "Better to die on our feet than to live on our knees," headed straightway into a group of regular army who had finally turned out to try to stop this business. He waded right into them, cutting heads like a pirate, until they shot him as full of holes as aunties' drawers. That's your Spaniards. Even the queers have balls. Well, this wasn't my show, so I backed up, opened the door, and stepped into the building. I just had a moment to recognize which building I had picked when St. Toad gave me his bilious eye and said,
"You again?"
The trip was less interesting this time. I'd seen it before, after all, and I had time to think a bit and realise that old Frogface wasn't using a time machine or any mechanical device at all. Then I was in front of a pyramid. They missed that stop last time, and I waited to arrive back in the Hotel Doruti. To my surprise, when there was a final jerk in the dimensions or whatever they were, I found myself someplace else.
0005, in fact, was in an enormous marbled room, deliberately designed to impress the bejesus out of any and all visitors. Pillars reached up to cyclopean heights, supporting a ceiling too high and murky to be visible. And every wall, of which there seemed to be 5, was the same impenetrable ivory-grain marble. The eyes instinctively sought the gigantic throne, in the shape of an apple with a seat carved out of it, and made of a flawless gold which gleamed the more brightly in the dim lighting. And the old man who sat on the throne, his white beard reaching almost to the lap of his much whiter robe, commanded attention when he spoke.
"If I may be trite,"
he said in a resonant voice,
"you are welcome, my son."
This still wasn't high church, but it was a definite improvement over the digs where St. Toad and his loathsome objets d'art festered. Still, 0005's British common sense was disturbed.
"I say,"
he ventured,
"you're not some sort of mystic, are you? I must tell you that I don't intend to convert to anything heathen."
"Conversion, as you understand it,"
the aged figure told him placidly,
"consists of pounding one's own words into a man's ears until they start coming out of his mouth. Nothing is of less interest to me. You need have no fear on that ground."
"I see,"
0005 pondered.
"This wouldn't be Shangri-La or some such place, would it?"
"This is Dallas, Texas, my son."
The old man's eyes bore a slight twinkle, although his demeanor otherwise remained grave.
"We are below the sewers of Deally Plaza, and I am the Deally Lama."
0005 shook his head.
"I don't mind having my leg pulled,"
he began.
"I am the Deally Lama,"
the old man repeated.
"and this is the headquarters of the Arisian Liberation Front."
"A joke's a joke,"
Chips said.
"But how did you manage that frog-faced creature back in the Starry Wisdom Church?"
"Satagua? He's not managed by us. We saved you from him, in fact, twice."
"Sathagua?"
Chips repeated.
"I thought the swine's name was St. Toad."
"To be sure, that is one of his names. When he first appeared in Hyperborea, he was known as Satagua, and that is how he is recorded in the narcotic manuscripts, the Necronomicon, and other classics. The Atlantean high priests, Clarkish Tun and Love Caraft, wrote the best descriptions of him, but their works have not survived, except in our own archives."
"You do put on a good front,"
0005 said sincerely.
"I suppose fairly soon you'll get around to telling me that I've been brought here due to some karma or other."
He was actually wishing there was some place to sit down. No doubt it added to the Lama's dignity to sit while Chips had to stand, but it had been a hard night already, and his feet hurt.
Yes, I have many revelations for you,
the old man said.
I was afraid of that. Isn't there some place where I can bring my arse to anchor, as my Uncle Sid would say, before I listen to your wisdom? I'm sure it's going to be a long time in the telling.
The old man ignored this.
This is the turning point in history,
he said.
All the forces of evil, dispersed and often in conflict before, have been brought together under one sign, the eye in the pyramid. All the forces of good have been gathered also under the sign of the apple.
I see.
00005 nodded.
And you want to enlist me on the side of good?
Not at all,
the old man cried, bouncing up and down in his seat with laughter.
I want to invite you to stay here with us while the damned fools fight it out above ground.
00005 frowned.
That isn't a sporting attitude,
he said disapprovingly, but then he grinned.
Oh, I almost fell for it, didn't I? You are pulling my leg.
I am telling you the truth,
the old man said vehemently.
How do you suppose I have lived to this advanced age? By running off to join in every idiotic ballroom brawl, world war, or Armageddon that comes along? Let me remind you of the street where we picked you up. It is entirely typical of the proceedings during the Kali Yuga. Those imbeciles are using live ammunition, son. Do you want me to tell you the secret of longevity, lad? My secret? I have lived so outrageously long because...
He spoke with deliberate emphasis.
I don't give a fuck for good and evil.
I should be ashamed to say so, if I were you.
Chips replied coolly.
If the whole world felt like you, we'd all be a sorry kettle of fish.
Very well.
The old man started to raise an arm.
I'll send you back to St. Toad.
Wait.
Chips stirred uneasily.
Couldn't you send me to confront evil in one of its, more human forms?
Aha!
The old man sneered.
You want the lesser evil, is it? Those false choices are passing away even as we speak. If you want to confront evil, you will have to confront it on its own terms, not in the form that suits your own mediocre concept of a last judgment. Stay here with me, lad. Evil is much more nasty than you imagine.
Never,
Chip said firmly.
Ours not to reason why, ours but to do or die. Any Englishman would tell you the same.
No doubt,
the old man snickered.
Your countrymen are as fat-headed as these Texans above us, glorifying that idiotic light brigade the way these bumpkins brag about their defeat at the Alamo, as if stepping in front of a steamroller were the most admirable thing a man could do with his time. Let me tell you a story, son.
You may, if you wish,
00005 said stiffly.
But no cynical parable will change my sense of right and duty.
Actually, you're glad of the interlude. You're not at all that eager to face the powers of Satagua again. Let that pass.
The old man shifted to a more comfortable position, and, still oblivious of Chips's tired shifting from leg to leg, began.
This is the story of Our Lady of Discord, Eris, daughter of Chaos, mother of Fortuna. You have read some of it in Bullfinch, no doubt, but his is the exoteric version. I am about to give you the inside story. Is the thought of a unicorn a real thought? In a sense, that is the basic question of philosophy.
I thought you were going to tell me a story, not launch into some dreary German metaphysics. I had enough of that at the university.
Quite so. The thought of a unicorn is a real thought, then, to be brief. So is the thought of the Redeemer on the cross, the cow who jumped over the moon, the lost continent of Mu, the gross national product, the square root of -1, and anything else capable of mobilizing emotional energy. And so, in a sense, Eris and the other Olympians were, and are, real. At the same time, in another sense, there is only one true God and your Redeemer in his only begotten Son. And the Luigor, like Tsathoggua, are real enough to reach out and draw you into their world, which is on the other side of nightmare. But I promise to keep the philosophy to a minimum. You recall the story of the golden apple? In the exoteric and expurgated version, at least. True version is the same up to a point. Zeus, a terrible old bore, by the way, did throw a bash on Olympus, and he did slight Our Lady by not inviting her. She did make an apple, but it was Acapulco gold, not metallic gold. She wrote Callisti on it, to the prettiest one, and rolled it into the banquet hall. Everybody, not just the goddesses, that's a male chauvinist myth, started fighting over who had the right to smoke it. Paris was never called in to pass judgment. That's all some poet's fancy. The Trojan War was just another imperialistic rumble and had no connection with these events at all. What really happened was that everybody was squabbling over the apple and working up a sweat and pushing one another around, and pretty soon their vibrations, gods have very high vibration, exactly at the speed of light, in fact, heated up the apple enough to unleash some heavy fumes. In a word, the Olympians all got stoned. And they saw a vision, or a series of visions. In the first vision, they saw Yahweh, a neighboring god with a world of his own which overlapped theirs in some places. He was clearing the set to change his valance and start a new show. His method struck them as rather barbarous. He was, in fact, drowning everybody, except one family that he allowed to escape in an ark. "This is chaos," said Hermes. "That Yahweh is a mean mother, even for a god." And they looked at the vision more closely, and because they could see into the future, and were all, like every intelligent entity, rabid Laurel and Hardy fans, and because they were zonked on the weed, they saw that Yahweh bore the face of Oliver Hardy. All around him, below the mountain on which he lived, his world was flat, the waters rose and rose. They saw drowning men, drowning women, innocent babies sinking beneath the waves. They were ready to vomit, and then another came and stood beside Yahweh, looking at the panorama of horrors below, and he was Yahweh's adversary, and, stoned as they were, he looked like Stanley Laurel to them. "Now look what you made me do." And that was the first vision. They looked again, and they saw Lee Harvey Oswald perched in the window of the Texas School Book Depository, and he again wore the face of Stanley Laurel. And because this world had been created by a great god named Earl Warren, Oswald fired the only shots that day, and John Fitzgerald Kennedy was, as the Salvation Army charmingly expressed it, promoted to glory. "This is confusion," said Athena with her owl eyes flashing, for she was more familiar with the world created by the god Mark Lane. Then they saw a hallway, and Oswald Laurel was led out between two policemen. Suddenly, Jack Ruby, with the face of Oliver Hardy, stepped forward and fired a pistol right into that frail little body. And then Ruby spoke the eternal words to the corpse at his feet. "Now look what you made me do," he said. And that was the second vision. Next, they saw a city of 550,000 men, women, and children, and in an instant the city vanished. Shadows remained where the men were gone. A firestorm raged, burning pimps and infants and an old statue of a happy Buddha, and mice and dogs, and old men and lovers. And a mushroom cloud arose above it all. This was in a world created by the crudest of all gods, realpolitik. "This is discord," said Apollo, disturbed, laying down his lute. Harry Truman, a servant of realpolitik, wearing the face of Oliver Hardy, looked upon his work and saw that it was good. But beside him, Albert Einstein, a servant of that most elusive and gnomic of gods, truth, burst into tears, and familiar tears of Stanley Laurel, facing the consequences of his own karma. For a brief instant, Truman was troubled, but then he remembered the eternal words. "Now look what you made me do," he said. And that was the third vision. Now they saw trains, many trains, all of them running on time, and the trains crisscrossed Europe and ran 24 hours a day, and they all came to a few destinations that were alike. There, the human cargo was stamped, catalogued, processed, executed with gas, tabulated, recorded, stamped again, cremated, and disposed. "This is bureaucracy," said Dionysus, and he smashed his wine jug in anger. Beside him his lynx glared balefully. And then they saw the man who had ordered this, Adolf Hitler, wearing still the mask of Oliver Hardy, and he turned to a certain rich man, Baron Rothschild, wearing the mask of Stanley Laurel. And they knew this was the world created by the god Hegel, and the angel Thesis was meeting the demon Antithesis. Then Hitler spoke the eternal words. "Now look what you made me do," he said. And that was the fourth vision. They did then look further, and lo, high as they were, they saw the founding of a great republic, and proclamations hailing new gods named Due Process and Equal Rights for All. And they saw many in high places in the republic form a separate cult and worship Mammon and Power. And the republic became an empire, and soon due process and equal rights for all were not worshipped, and even Mammon and Power were given only lip service, for the true God of all was now the impudent "What can I do?" and his dull brother, "What we did yesterday?" and his ugly and vicious sister, "Get them before they get us." "This is aftermath," said Hera, and her bosom shook with tears for the fate of the children of that nation. And they saw many bombings, many riots, many rooftop snipers, many Molotov cocktails, and they saw the capital city in ruins, and the leader, wearing the face of Stanley Laurel, taken prisoner amid the rubble of his palace. And they saw the chief of the revolutionaries look about at the rubble and the streets full of corpses, and they heard him sigh. And then he addressed the leader, and he spoke the eternal words. "Now look what you made me do," he said. And that was the fifth vision. And now the Olympians were coming down, and they looked at each other in uncertainty and dismay. Zeus himself spoke first. "Man," he said, "that was heavy grass." "Far fucking out," Hermes agreed solemnly. "Tree fucking mendus," added Dionysus, petting his lynx. "We were really fucking into it," Hera summed up for all. And they turned their eyes again on the golden apple, and read the word Our Lady Eris had written upon it, that most multi-ordinal of all words, Korhisti. And they knew that each god and goddess, and each man and woman, was in the privacy of the heart, the prettiest one, the fairest, the most innocent, the best. And they repented themselves of not having invited Our Lady Eris to their party, and they summoned her forth and asked her, "Why did you never tell us before that all categories are false, and all good and evil a delusion of limited perspective?" And Eris said, "As men and women are actors on a stage of our devising, so are we actors on the stage devised by the 5 fates. You had to believe in good and evil, and pass judgments on your creatures, the men and women below. It was a curse the fates put upon you. But now you have come to the great doubt, and you are free. The Olympians thereupon lost interest in the god game, and soon were forgotten by humanity. For she had shown them a great light, and a great light destroys shadows. And we are all, gods and mortals, nothing else but gliding shadows. Do you believe that?
No,
said Fish and Chips.
Very well.
The Deally Lama said somberly.
Begone, back to the world of Maya.
And Fish and Chips whirled head over heels into a vortex of bleatings and squealings, as time and space were given another sharp tug, and nearly a month later, head over heels, the midget is up and tottering across Route 91 as the rented Ford Brontosaurus shrieks to a stop and Saul and Barney are out the doors, every cop instinct telling them that a man who runs from an accident is hiding something. But John Dillinger, driving toward Vegas from the north, continues to hum.
Goodbye forever, old sweethearts and gals. God bless you.
And the same tug in space-time grips Adam Weishaupt 2 centuries earlier, causing him to abandon his planned soft sell and blurt out to an astonished Johann Wolfgang von Goethe,
Spielen Sie Strip Schnipp Schnapp?
And Chips, hearing Weishaupt's words, is back in the graveyard at Ingolstadt as 4 dark figures move away in dusk.
Strip Schnipp Schnapp?
Goethe asks, putting hand on chin in a pose that was later to become famous.
Das ist ein Hochzauberwerk?
Ja.
Weishaupt says nervously.
Der Zweck heiligt die Mittel.
Ingolstadt always reminds me of the set of a bleeding Frankenstein movie. And after St. Toad and that Shoggoth chap and the old Lama with his wog metaphysics, it was no help at all to have an invisible voice ask me to join him in a bawdy card game. I faced some weird scenes in HM service, but this Fernando Poo caper was turning out to be outright unwholesome. In fact, unheimlich, as these krauts would say. And in the distance, I began to hear wog music, but with a yank beat to it, and suddenly I knew the worst. That blasted Lama, or St. Toad, or somebody had lifted nearly a month out of my life. I had walked into St. Toad's after midnight on March 31st. Call it April 1st, then. And this would be April 30th or May 1st, Walpurgisnacht, when all the kraut ghosts are out. And I was probably considered dead back in London. And if I called in and tried to explain what had happened, old W would be downright psychiatric about the matter. Oh, he'd be sure I was well around the bend. It was a rum go, either way. Then I remembered that the old Lama in Dallas had said he was sending me to the final battle between good and evil. This was probably it, right here, right now, this night in Ingolstadt. A bit breathtaking to think of that. I wondered when the angels of the Lord would appear. Bloody soon, I hoped. It would be nice to have them around when old Nick unleashed the Shoggoth and St. Toad and that lot. So I toddled out into the streets of Ingolstadt and started sniffing around for the old sulphur and brimstone.
And half a mile below, and 12 hours earlier, George Dorn and Stella Maris were smoking some Alamet black hash with Harry Coyne.
You haven't got a bad punch for an intellectual,
Coyne said with warm regard.
You're pretty good at rape yourself,
George replied.
For the world's most incompetent assassin.
Coyne started to draw back his lip in an angry snarl, but the hash was too strong.
Hagbard told you, Ace?
He asked bashfully.
He told me most of it,
George said.
I know that everybody on this ship once worked for the Illuminati directly or for one of their governments. I know that Hagbard has been an outlaw for more than 2 decades.
23 years exactly,
Stella said archly.
That figures,
George nodded.
23 years then, and never killed anybody until that incident with the spider ships 4 days ago.
Oh, he killed us.
Harry said dreamily, drawing on the pipe.
What he does is worse than capital punishment while it's going on. I can't say I'm the same man I was before, but it's pretty bad until you come through.
I know.
George grinned.
I've had a few samples myself.
Hagbard's system,
Stella said.
is very simple. He just gives you a good look at your own face in a mirror. He lets you see the puppet strings. It's still up to you to break them. He's never forced anyone to do anything that goes against their heart. Of course...
She frowned in concentration.
He does sort of maneuver you into places where you have to find out in a hurry just what your heart is saying to you. Did he ever tell you about the Indians?
The Shoshone?
George asked.
The cesspool gag?
Let's play a game.
Coyne interrupted, sinking lower in his chair as the hash hit him harder.
One of us in this room is a Martian, and we've got to guess from the conversation which one it is.
Okay.
Stella said easily.
Not the Shoshone.
She told George.
The Mohawk.
You're not the Martian.
Coyne giggled.
You stick to the subject, and that's a human trait.
George, trying to decide if the octopus on the wall was somehow connected with the Martian riddle, said,
I want to hear about Hagbard and the Mohawk. Maybe that'll help us identify the Martian. You think up good games.
He added kindly.
For a guy who was sent on 7 assassination missions and fucked up every one of them.
I'm dumb, but I'm lucky,
Coyne said.
There's always somebody else there blasting away at the same time. Politicians are awfully unpopular these days, Ace.
This was a myth Hagbard had confided to George. Until Harry Coyne had completed his course in the Chilean system, it was better if he believed himself the world's most unsuccessful assassin rather than face the truth, that he had goofed only on his first job, Dallas, November 22nd, 1963, and really had killed 5 men since then. Of course, even if Hagbard wasn't a holy man any longer, he still was tricky. Maybe Harry had indeed missed every time. Perhaps Hagbard was keeping the image of Harry as mass murderer in George's mind to see if George could relate to the man's present, instead of being hung up on his past.
At least I've learned this much,
George thought.
The word past is always in quotes for me now.
The Mohawk,
Stella said, leaning back lazily. George's male organ, or penis, or dick, or whatever the hell is the natural word, if there is a natural word.
Well, my cock then. My delicious, ever-hungry cock rose a centimeter as her blouse tightened on her breasts. Lord God, we'd been humping like warthogs in rutting season for hours and hours and hours, and I was still horny and still in love with her. And I probably always will be, but then again maybe I'm the Martian. Well, in fact, the old pussy hunter didn't rise more than a millimeter, not a centimeter, and he was as slow as an old man getting out of bed in January. I had just about fucked until my brains came out my ears, even before Harry brought in the hash and wanted to talk. Looking for the Martian. Looking for the governor of Dorne. Looking for the Illuminati. Krishna chasing his tail around the curved space of the Einsteinian universe until he disappears up his own ass. Leaving behind a behind. The back of the void. The Dorne theory of circutheosodominosis.
owned some land.
She continued.
That beautiful black face, like ebon melody. Yes, no painter could show, but Bach could hint the delight of those purple-tinted lips in that black face, saying,
And the government wanted to steal the land, to build a dam.
The inside of her cunt had that purple hue to it also, and there was a tawny beige in her palm, like Caucasian skin. There were so many delights in her body, and in mine too. Treasures that couldn't be spent in a million years of the most tender and violent fucking.
Hagbard was the engineer hired to build the dam, but when he found out that the Indians would be dispossessed and relocated on less fertile ground, he refused the job.
Eris. Eros spelled sideways.
He broke his contract, so the government sued him.
She said.
That's how he got to be a close friend with the Mohawk.
Which was all pure crapperoo. Obviously Hagbard had gone to court as a lawyer for the Indians, but that one touch of shame in him had kept him from admitting it to Stella, that he had once been a lawyer. So he made up that bit about being the engineer on the dam to explain how he got involved in the case.
He helped them move when they were dispossessed.
I could see bronze men and women moving in twilight, a hill in the background.
This was a long time ago, back in the 50s, I think.
Hagbard was a hell of a lot older than he looked.
One Indian was carrying a raccoon he said was his grandfather. He was a very old man himself. He said grandfather could remember General Washington and how he changed after he became president.
He would be there tonight. That being who had once been George Washington and Adam Weishaupt. He of whom Hitler had said,
"He is already among us. He is intrepid and terrible. I am afraid of him."
Hagbard says he kept thinking of Patrick Henry, the one man who saw what had happened at the Constitutional Convention. It was Henry who had looked at the Constitution and said right away, "I smell a rat. It squints toward monarchy." The old Indian, whose name was Uncle John Feather, said that grandfather, when he was a man, could speak to all animals. He said the Mohawk nation was more than the living. It was the soul and the soil joined together. When the land was taken, some of the soul died. That was why he couldn't speak to all animals, but only to those who had once been part of his family.
The soul is in the blood, moving the blood. It is in the night especially. Nutley is a typical Catholic-dominated New Jersey town, and the Dorns are Baptists, so I was hemmed in two ways. But even as a boy, I used to walk along the Passaic looking for Indian arrowheads, and the soul would move when I found one. Who was the anthropologist who thought that the Ojibwe believed all rocks were alive? A chief had straightened him out. "Open your eyes," he said, "and you'll see which rocks are alive." We haven't had our Frobenius yet. American anthropology is like virgins writing about sex.
I know who the Martian is,
Coin crooned in a sing-song.
but I'm not telling. Not yet.
That man who was either the most successful or the most unsuccessful assassin of the 20th century, and who had raped me, which was supposed to destroy my manhood forever according to some idiots, was smashed out of his skull, and he looked so happy that I was happy for him.
Hagbard
Stella went on.
stood there like a tree. He was paralyzed. Finally, old Uncle John Feather asked what was the matter.
Stella leaned forward, her face more richly black against the golden octopus on the wall.
Hagbard had foreseen the ecological catastrophe. He had seen the rise of the welfare state, warrior liberalism, as he calls it, and the spread of Marxism out of Russia across the world. He saw why it all had to happen, with or without the Illuminati helping it along. He understood the snafu principle.
He had worked all that night, after explaining to Uncle John Feather that he was troubled in his heart at the tragedy of the Mohawk, not mentioning the more enormous tragedy coming at the planet, the tragedy which the old man understood already in his own terms. Hard work, carrying pitiful cheap furniture from cabins onto trucks, tying whole households' possessions with tough ropes. He was sweating and winded when they finished shortly before dawn. The next day, he had burned his naturalization papers and put the ashes in an envelope addressed to the President of the United States, with a brief note. Everything relevant is ruled irrelevant. Everything material is ruled immaterial. An ex-citizen. The ashes of his Army Reserve discharge went to the Secretary of Defense with a briefer note. Non serviam. An ex-slave. That year's income tax form went to the Secretary of the Treasury after he wiped his ass on it. The note said, "Try robbing a poor box. Der Einzige." His fury still mounting, he grabbed his copy of Das Kapital off the bookshelf, smiling bitterly at the memory of his sarcastic marginal notes, scrawled, "Without private property, there is no private life," on the flyleaf, and mailed it to Joseph Stalin in the Kremlin. Then he buzzed his secretary, gave her 3 months' pay in lieu of notice of dismissal, and walked out of his law office forever. He had declared war on all governments of the world. His afternoon was spent giving away his savings, which at that time amounted to $70,000. Some he gave to drunks on the street, some to little boys or little girls in parks. When the stock exchange closed, he was on Wall Street, handing out fat bundles of bills to the wealthiest-looking men he could spot, telling them, "Enjoy it. Before you die, it won't be worth shit." That night, he slept on a bench in Grand Central Terminal. In the morning, flat broke, he signed on as ABS aboard a merchant ship to Norway. That summer, he tramped across Europe, working as a tourist guide, cook, tutor, any odd job that fell his way, but mostly talking and listening about politics. He heard that the Marshall Plan was a sneaky way of robbing Europe under the pretense of helping it, that Stalin would have more trouble with Tito than he had with Trotsky, that the Viet Minh would surrender soon and the French would retake Indochina, that nobody in Germany was a Nazi anymore, that everybody in Germany was still a Nazi, that Dewey would unseat Truman easily. During his last walking tour of Europe in the 1930s, he had heard that Hitler only wanted Czechoslovakia and would do anything to avoid war with England, that Stalin's troubles with Trotsky would never end, that all Europe would go socialist after the next war, that America would certainly enter the war when it came, that America would certainly stay out of the war when it came. One idea had remained fairly constant, however, and he heard it everywhere. That idea was that more government, tougher government, more honest government was the answer to all human problems. Hagbard began making notes for the treatise that later became Never Whistle While You're Pissing. He began with a section that he later moved to the middle of the book.
It is now theoretically possible to link the human nervous system into a radio network so that, micro-miniaturized receivers being implanted in people's brains, the messages coming out of these radios would be indistinguishable to the subjects from the voice of their own thoughts. One central transmitter located in the nation's capital could broadcast all day long what the authorities wanted the people to believe. The average man on the receiving end of these broadcasts would not even know he was a robot. He would think it was his own voice he was listening to. The average woman could be treated similarly. It is ironic that people will find such a concept both shocking and frightening. Like Orwell's 1984, this is not a fantasy of the future, but a parable of the present. Every citizen in every authoritarian society already has such a radio built into his or her brain. This radio is the little voice that asks each time a desire is formed, is it safe? Will my wife, my husband, my boss, my church, and my community approve? Will people ridicule and mock me? Will the police come and arrest me? This little voice the Freudians call the super-ego, with Freud himself vividly characterized as the ego's harsh master. With a more functional approach, Paris, Hefferlein, and Goodman in Gestalt therapy describe this process as a set of conditioned verbal habits. This set, which is fairly uniform throughout any authoritarian society, determines the actions which will and will not occur there. Let us consider humanity a biogram, the basic DNA blueprint of the human organism and its potentials, united with a logogram, this set of conditioned verbal habits. The biogram has not changed in several 100,000 years. The logogram is different in each society. When the logogram reinforces the biogram, we have a libertarian society, such as still can be found among some American Indian tribes. Like Confucianism before it became authoritarian and rigidified, American Indian ethics is based on speaking from the heart and acting from the heart, that is, from the biogram. No authoritarian society can tolerate this. All authority is based on conditioning men and women to act from the logogram, since the logogram is a set created by those in authority. Every authoritarian logogram divides society as it divides the individual into alienated halves. Those at the bottom suffer what I call the burden of nescience, the natural sensory activity of the biogram, what the person sees, hears, smells, tastes, feels, and, above all, what the organism as a whole, or as a potential whole, wants, is always irrelevant and immaterial. The authoritarian logogram, not the field of sensed experience, determines what is relevant and material. This is as true of a highly paid advertising copywriter as it is of an engine lathe operator. The person acts not on personal experience and the evaluations of the nervous system, but on the orders from above. Thus, personal experience and personal judgment being non-operational, these functions become also less real. They exist, if at all, only in that fantasy land which Freud called the unconscious.
Since nobody has found a way to prove that the Freudian unconscious really exists, it can be doubted that personal experience and personal judgment exist. It is an act of faith to assume they do. The organism has become, as Marx said, a tool, a machine, a robot. Those at the top of the authoritarian pyramid, however, suffer an equal and opposite burden of omniscience. All that is forbidden to the servile class, the web of perception, evaluation, and participation in the sensed universe, is demanded of the members of the master class. They must attempt to do the seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, and decision-making for the whole society. But a man with a gun is told only that which people assume will not provoke him to pull the trigger. Since all authority and government are based on force, the master class, with its burden of omniscience, faces the servile class, with its burden of nescience, precisely as a highwayman faces his victim. Communication is possible only between equals. The master class never abstracts enough information from the servile class to know what is actually going on in the world where the actual productivity of society occurs. Furthermore, the logogram of any authoritarian society remains fairly inflexible as time passes, but everything else in the universe constantly changes. The result can only be progressive disorientation among the rulers. The end is debacle. The schizophrenia of authoritarianism exists both in the individual and in the whole society. I call this the snafu principle.
That autumn, Hagbard settled in Rome. He worked as a tourist guide, amusing himself by combining authentic Roman history with Cecil B. DeMille. None of the tourists ever caught him out. He also spent long hours scrutinizing the published reports of Interpol. His Wanderjahr was ending. He was preparing for action. Never subject to guilt or masochism, he had one reason only for his dispersal of his savings: to prove to himself what he intended to do could be done starting from zero. When winter arrived, his studies were complete. Interpol's crime statistics had very kindly provided him with a list of those commodities which, either because of tariffs intended to stifle competition or because of morals laws, could become the foundation of a successful career in smuggling. 1 year later, in the Hotel Claridge on 44th Street in New York, Hagbard was placed under arrest by 2 U.S. narcotics agents named Galley and Eichmann.
Well, don't take it too hard,
Galley said.
We're only following orders.
It's okay,
Hagbard said.
Don't feel guilty, but what are you going to do with my cats?
Galley knelt on the floor and examined the kittens thoughtfully, scratching one under the chin, rubbing the ear of the other.
What's their names?
He asked.
The male is called Vagina,
Hagbard said.
The female I call Penis.
The male is called what?
Eichmann asked, blinking.
The male is Vagina and the female is Penis,
Hagbard said innocently.
But there's a metaphysic behind it. First, you have to ask yourself, which appeared earlier on this planet, life or death? Have you ever thought about that?
Oh, this guy's nuts,
Galley told Eichmann.
You've got to realize,
Hagbard went on,
that life is a coming apart and death is a coming together. Does that help?
I never know whether Hagbard is talking profundity or asininity,
George said dreamily, toking away.
Reincarnation works backward in time,
Hagbard went on as the narcs opened drawers and peered under chairs.
You always get reborn into an earlier historical period. Mussolini is a witch in the 14th century now and catching hell from the Inquisitors for his bum karma in this age. People who remember the past are all deluded. The only ones who really remember past incarnations remember the future, and they become science fiction writers.
A little old lady from Chicago walked into George's room with a collection can marked Mother's March Against Phimosis. He gave her a dime and she thanked him and left. After the door closed, George wondered if she had been a hallucination or just a woman who had fallen through a space-time warp and landed on the Leif Erikson.
What the hell are these?
Eichmann asked. He had been searching Hagbard's closet and found some red, white, and blue bumper stickers. The top half of each letter was blue with white stars, and the bottom half was red and white stripes. They looked patriotic as all get out. The slogan formed this way was, "Legalize abortion, pregnancy is a Jewish plot." Hagbard had been circulating these in neighborhoods like the Yorkville section of Manhattan, the western suburbs of Chicago, and other places where old-fashioned Father Coughlin, Joe McCarthy-style Irish Catholic fascism was still strong. This was a trial run on the logogram-biogram double-bind tactic, out of which the Deally Lama later developed Operation Mindfuck.
Patriotic stickers,
Hagbard explained.
Well, they look patriotic.
Eichmann conceded dubiously.
Did a little woman from Chicago just walk through this room?
George asked.
No.
Harry Coyne said, toking again.
I didn't see any woman from Chicago, but I know who the Martian is.
What the hell are these?
Galley asked. He had found some business-sized cards saying red in green letters and green in red letters.
When you're out of it all the way on the mountain,
George asked.
That's neither the biogram nor the logogram, right? What the hell is it then?
An antigram,
Hagbard explained, still helpful.
The cards are an antigram?
Eichmann repeated, bewildered.
I may have to place you under arrest and take you downtown.
Hagbard warned.
You've both been very naughty boys, breaking and entering, pointing a gun at me. That's technically assault with a deadly weapon. Seizing my narcotics, that's theft. All sorts of invasion of privacy. Very, very naughty.
You can't arrest us,
Eichmann whined.
We're supposed to arrest you.
Which is red and which is green?
Hagbard asked.
Look again.
They looked, and red was now really red and green was really green. Actually, the tints changed according to the angle at which Hagbard held the card, but he wasn't giving away his secrets to them.
I can also change up and down,
he added.
Worse yet, I clog zippers. Neither one of you can open your fly right now, for instance. My real gimmick, though, is reversing revolvers. Try to shoot me and the bullets will come out the back and you'll never use your good right hand again. Try it and see if I'm bluffing.
Can't you go a little easy on us, officer?
Eichmann took out his wallet.
A cop's salary ain't the greatest in the world, eh?
He nudged Hagbard insinuatingly.
Are you trying to bribe me?
Hagbard asked sternly.
Why not?
Harry Coyne whined.
You got nothing to gain by killing me. Take the money and put me off this sub at the first island you pass.
Well...
Hagbard said thoughtfully, counting the money.
I can get more,
Harry added.
I can send it to you.
I'm sure.
Hagbard put the money in his clamshell ashtray and struck a match. There was a brief merry blaze, and Hagbard asked calmly,
Do you have any other inducements to offer?
I'll tell you anything you want to know about the Illuminati.
Harry shrieked, really frightened now, realizing that he was in the hands of a madman to whom money meant nothing.
I know more about the Illuminati than you do,
Hagbard replied, looking bored.
Give me a philosophic reason, Harry. Is there any purpose in allowing a specimen like you to go on preying on the weak and innocent?
Honest, I'll go straight. I'll join your side. I'll work for you. Kill anybody you want.
That's a possibility,
Hagbard conceded.
It's a slim one, though. The world is full of killers and potential killers. Thanks to the Illuminati and their governments, there's hardly an adult male alive who hasn't had some military training. What makes you think I couldn't go out on the streets of any large city and find 10 better qualified killers than you inside an afternoon?
Okay,
Harry said, breathing hard.
I don't have no college education, but I'm not a fool either. Your men dragged me from Mad Dog Jail to this submarine. You want something, Ace? Otherwise, I'd be dead already.
Yes, I want something.
Hagbard leaned back in his chair.
Now you're getting warm, Harry. I want something, but I won't tell you what it is. You've got to produce it and show it to me without any clues or hints, and if you can't do that, I really will have you killed. I shit you not, fellow. This is my version of a trial for your past crimes. I'm the judge and the jury, and you've got to win an acquittal without knowing the rules. How do you like that game?
It ain't fair.
It's more of a chance than you gave any of the men you shot, isn't it?
Harry Coyne licked his lips.
I think you're bluffing.
he ventured finally.
You're some chicken shit liberal who doesn't believe in capital punishment. You're looking for an excuse to not kill me.
Look into my eyes, Harry. Do you see any mercy in them?
Coin began to perspire and finally looked down into his lap.
Okay,
he said hollowly.
How much time do I have?
Hagbard opened his drawer and took out his revolver. He cracked it open, showing the bullets, and quickly snapped it closed again. He slipped the safety catch, a procedure he later found unnecessary with George Dorn, who knew nothing about guns, and aimed at Harry's belly.
3 days and 3 minutes are both too long,
he said casually.
If you're ever going to get it, you're going to get it now.
Mama,
Coin heard himself exclaim.
You're going to shit your pants in a moment,
Hagbard said coldly.
Better not. I find bad smell is offensive, and I might shoot you just for that. And Mama isn't here, so don't call her again.
Coin saw himself lunging across the room, the gun roaring in mid-leap, but at least trying to get his hands on this bastard's throat before dying.
Pointless.
Hagbard grinned icily.
You'd never get out of the chair.
His finger tightened slightly, and Coin's gut churned. He knew enough about guns to know how easy it was to have an accident, and he thought of the gun going off even before the bastard Chilean intended it to, maybe even as he was on the edge of guessing the goddamn riddle. The pointlessness of it was the final horror, and he looked again into those eyes without guilt or pity or any weakness he could exploit. Then, for the first time in his life, Harry Coin knew peace, as he relaxed into death.
Good enough?
Hagbard said from far away, snapping the safety back in place.
You've got more on the ball than either of us realized.
Harry slowly came back and looked at that face and those eyes.
God,
he said.
I'm going to give you the gun in a minute,
Hagbard went on.
Then it's my turn to sweat. Of course, if you kill me, you'll never get off this sub alive, but maybe you'll think that's worthwhile just for revenge. On the other hand, maybe you'll be curious about that instant of peace, and you'll wonder if there's an easier way to get back there and if I can teach it to you. Maybe. One more thing before I toss you the gun. Everybody who joins me does it by free choice. When you said you'd come over to my side just because you were afraid of dying, you had no value to me at all. Here's the gun, Harry. Now, I want you to check it. There are no gimmicks, no missing firing pin or anything like that. No other tricks either. Nobody watching you through a peephole and ready to gun you down the minute you aim at me or anything like that. I'm totally at your mercy. What are you going to do?
Harry examined the gun carefully and looked back at Hagbard. He had never studied kinetics and orgonomy as Hagbard had, but he could read enough of the human face and body to know what was going on in the other man. Hagbard had that same peace he himself had experienced for a moment.
You win, you bastard,
Harry said, tossing the gun back.
I want to know how you do it.
Part of you already knows.
Hagbard smiled gently, putting the gun back in the drawer.
You just did it, didn't you?
What would he have done if I did block?
Harry asked Stella in present time.
Something, I don't know. A sudden act of some sort that scared you more than the gun. He plays it by ear. The Chilean system is never twice the same.
Then I was right. He wouldn't have killed me. It was all bluff.
Yes and no.
Stella looked past Harry and George into the distance.
He wasn't acting with you, he was manifesting. The mercilessness was quite real. There was no sentimentality involved in saving you. He did it because it's part of his demonstration.
His demonstration?
George asked, thinking of geometry problems and the neat QED at the bottom back in Nutley years and years ago.
I've known Hagbard longer than she has,
Eichmann said.
In fact, Gally and I were among the first people he enlisted. I've watched him over the years, and I still don't understand him, but I understand the demonstration.
You know,
George said absently,
when you two first came in, I thought you were a hallucination.
You never saw us at dinner because we work in the kitchen,
Gally explained.
We eat after everybody else.
Only a small part of the crew are former criminals,
Stella told George, who was looking confused.
Rehabilitating a Harry Coin, pardon me, Harry, doesn't really excite Hagbard much. Rehabilitating policemen and politicians and teaching them useful trades is work that really turns Hagbard on.
But not for sentimental reasons.
Eichmann emphasized.
It's part of his demonstration.
It's his memorial to the Mohawk Nation, too,
Stella said.
That trial set him off. He tried a direct frontal assault that time, attempting to cut through the logogram with a scalpel. It didn't work, of course. It never does. Then he decided, very well, I'll put them where words can't help and see what they do then. That's his demonstration. Hagbard actually, well, not actually, this is just what he told me, had started with 2 handicaps, intending to prove that they weren't handicaps. The first was that he would have a bank balance of exactly $0.00 at the beginning, and the second was that he would never kill another human being throughout the demonstration. That which was to be proved, namely that government is a hallucination or a self-fulfilling prophecy, could be shown only if all his equipment, including money and people, came to him through honest trade or voluntary association. Under these rules, he could not shoot even in self-defense, for the biogram of government servants was to be preserved, and only their logograms could be disconnected, deactivated, and diffused. The Chilean system was a consistent, although flexible, assault on the specific, conditioned reflex, that which compelled people to look outside themselves to a god or a government for direction or strength. The servants of government all carried weapons. Hagbard's insane scheme depended on rendering the weapons harmless. He called this the tar baby principle. You are attached to what you attack. Being a man of certain morbid self-insight, he realized that he himself exemplified the tar baby principle, and that his attacks on government kept him perpetually attached to it. It was his malign and insidious notion that government was even more attached to him, that his existence qua anarchist, qua smuggler, qua outlaw, aroused greater energetic streaming in government people than their existence aroused in him, that, in short, he was the tar baby on which they could not resist hurling themselves in anger and fear, an electrochemical reaction in which he could bond them to himself, just as the tar baby captured anyone who swung a fist at it. More. There was always more with Hagbard. He had been impressed on reading Weishaupt's Überstrip Schnippschnapp, Weltspielen und Fundwissenschaft, by the passage on the Order of Assassins, which read,
Surrounded by Muslim maniacs on one side and Christian maniacs on the other, the wise Lord Hassan preserved his people and his cult by bringing the art of assassination to aesthetic perfection. With just a few daggers strategically placed in exactly the right throats, he found wisdom's alternative to war, and preserved the people's by killing their leaders. Truly his was a most exemplary life of grandmotherly kindness.
Großmutterlich Gefälligkeit,
muttered Hagbard, who had been reading this in the original German.
Now, where have I heard that before?
In a second he remembered. The Mumon Khan, or Gateless Gate of Rinzai Zen, contained a story about a monk who kept asking a Zen master, "What is the Buddha?" Each time he asked, he got hit upside the head with the master's staff. Finally discouraged, he left and sought enlightenment with another master, who asked him why he had left the previous teacher. When the poor gawk explained, the second master gave him the ontological hotfoot. "Go back to your previous master at once," he cried, "and apologize for not showing enough appreciation of his grandmotherly kindness." Hagbard was not surprised that Weishaupt evidently knew in 1776, when Überstrip Schnippschnapp was written, about a book which hadn't yet been translated into any European tongue. He was astonished, however, that even the evil Ingolstadt Zauberer had understood the rudiments of the tar baby principle. It never pays to underestimate the Illuminati, he thought then, for the first time. He was to think of it many times in the next 2.5 decades. On April 24th, when he told Stella to deliver some Callisti gold to George's stateroom, Hagbard had already asked Fuckup the odds that Illuminati ships would arrive in Paos within the time he intended to be there. The answer was better than 100 to 1. He thought about what that meant, then buzzed to have Harry Coyne sent in. Harry swaggered to a chair, trying to look insolent, and said,
"So, you're the leader of the Discordians, eh?"
"Yes,"
Hagbard said evenly.
"And on this ship, my word is law. Wipe that silly grin off your face and sit up straight."
He observed the involuntary stiffening of Harry's body before the man caught himself and remembered to maintain his slouch. Typical. Coin could resist the key conditioning phrases, but only with effort.
Listen,
He said softly.
I will tell you only one more time.
Another Bavarian fire drill.
That this is my ship. You will address me as Captain Chelene. You will come to attention when I talk to you. Otherwise...
He let the phrase trail off. Slowly, Coin shifted to a more respectful kinesic posture, immediately modifying it by grinning more insolently. Well, that was good. The streak of rebellion ran deep. The breathing was not bad for a professional criminal. The only block seemed to be at the bottom of the exhalation. The grin was a defense against tears, of course, as with most chronic American smilers. Hagbard attempted a probe. Harry's father was the kind who pretended to consider the case and to toy with forgiveness before he would administer the thrashing.
Is that better?
Harry asked, accentuating his respectful posture and grinning more sarcastically.
A little,
Hagbard said, sounding mollified.
But I don't know what I'm going to do with you, Harry. That's a bad bunch you've been mixed up with. Very un-American.
He paused to get a reaction to the word. It came at once.
Their money is as good as anyone's,
Harry said defiantly. His shoes crept backwards as he spoke, and his neck decreased an inch. The turtle reflex, Hagbard called it, and it was a sure sign of the repressed guilt denied by the man's voice.
You were born pretty poor, weren't you?
Hagbard asked in a neutral tone.
Poor? We was white niggers.
Well, I guess there's some excuse for you.
Hagbard watched. The grin grew wider. The body imperceptibly moved back towards slouching.
But to turn on your own country, Harry, that's bad. That's the lowest thing a human being can do. It's like turning against your own mother.
The toes curled inward again, tentatively. What did Harry's father say before wielding the belt? Hagbard caught it.
Harry!
He repeated it gravely.
You haven't been acting like a proper white man. You've been acting like you got nigger blood.
The grin stretched to the breaking point and became a grimace. The body stiffened to the most respectful possible posture.
Now, look here, sir,
Harry began.
You got no call to talk to me that way.
And you're not even ashamed!
Hagbard ran over him.
You don't show any remorse!
He shook his head with profound discouragement.
I can't let you wander around loose committing more crimes and treasons. I'm going to have to feed you to the sharks.
Listen, Captain Chelene, sir, I've got a money belt under this shirt, and it's full of more $100 bills than you ever saw at one time.
Are you trying to bribe me?
Hagbard asked sternly. The rest of the scene would be easy, he reflected. Part of his mind drifted to the Illuminati ships he would meet at Peos. There was no way to use the Chilean system without communicating, and he knew the crew would be protected against him by some Illuminati variation on the earwax of Ulysses' men passing the sirens. The money would go in the giant clamshell ashtray, a real shocker for a man like Coin, but what would he do about the Illuminati ships? When the time came to produce the gun, he slipped the safety off viciously. If I'm going to join the ancient brotherhood of killers, he thought morosely, maybe I should have the stomach to start with a visible target.
3 days and 3 minutes are both too long,
he said, trying to sound casual.
If you're ever going to get it, you're going to get it now.
They would be at Peos in less than an hour, he thought, as Coin involuntarily cried,
Mama!
Like Dutch Schultz, Hagbard reflected. Like how many others? It would be interesting to interview doctors and nurses and find out how many people passed out with that primordial cry for the all-protector on their lips. But Harry finally surrendered, abdicated, left the robot running itself according to the biogram. He was no longer sitting in an insolent slouch, a respectful attention, a guilty cramp. He was simply sitting. He was ready for death.
Good enough,
Hagbard said.
You've got more on the ball than either of us realized.
The man would now transfer his submissive reflexes to Hagbard, and the next stage would be longer and harder before he learned to stop playing roles entirely and just manifest, as he had in the face of extinction. The gun gambit was variation number 2 of the third basic tactic in the Chilean system. It had 5 usual sequels. Hagbard picked the most dangerous one. He usually did, since he didn't much like the gun gambit at all, and could only stomach it if he gave most of the subjects a chance at the other role. This time, however, he knew he had another motive. Somewhere deep inside, a coward in him hoped Harry Coyne was crazier than he had estimated, and would in fact shoot. That way, Hagbard could avoid the decision awaiting him in Peos.
You win, you bastard,
Coyne's voice said. Hagbard came back and quickly rushed through a small verbal game involving hell images picked up from Harry's childhood. When he had Coyne sent back to his room under light security, he slouched in his chair and rubbed his eyes tiredly. He probed for Dorn and found the Deally Lama was on that channel broadcasting.
Leave the kid alone,
he beamed.
It's my turn now. Go contemplate your navel, you old fraud.
A shower of rose petals was the nonverbal answer. The Lama faded out. George went on rapping to himself on the themes planted by the elf leader. Odd, the big red one. I think it was his eye. The eye of Apollo. His luminous eye.
Aye, trust me not,
Hagbard beamed.
Trust not a man who's rich in flax, his morals maybe sadly lacks. Some of my own doubts getting in here.
He thought.
Her name is Stella Maris, Black Star of the Seas. I won't tell him who she and Mavis really are. George, I want you in the captain's control room.
George should start with variation number 1, the Liebestadt, or orgasm death trip, Hagbard decided. Make him aware of the extent to which he treats women as objects. And, of course, give him some mystical hogwash later to gloss it over temporarily, so the doubt would be pushed into the unconscious for a while. Yes, George was already on the pornography trip, very similar to Atlanta Hope and Smiling Jim Treponema, except that in his case it was egodystonic.
That was a good trick,
George said a few moments later in the captain's control room.
How you got me up here on the bridge with that telepathy thing?
Hagbard, still thinking about the decision in Peos, tried to look innocent when he replied.
I called you on the intercom.
He realized that he was whistling and pissing at once, worrying about Peos as well as about George, and brought himself back sharply. Absurd was the word in George's mind. Absurd innocence.
Well,
Hagbard thought,
I fucked that one up.
You think I can't tell a voice in my head from a voice in my ears?
George demanded. Hagbard roared with laughter, totally in the present again. But after George had been sent to the chapel for his initiation, the problem returned. Either the demonstration failed, or the demonstration failed. Double bind, damned both ways. It was infuriating, but all the books had warned him long ago, as ye give, so shall ye get. He had used the Chilean system on quite a few people over nearly 3 decades, and now he was in the middle of a classic Chilean trap himself. There was no correct answer, except to give up trying. When the moment came, though, he found that part of him had not given up trying.
Ready for destruction of enemy ships,
said Howard. Hagbard shook his head. George was remembering some crazy incident in which he had tried to commit suicide while standing by the Passaic River, and Hagbard kept picking up parts of that bum trip while trying to clear his own head.
I wish we could communicate with them,
he said aloud, realizing that he was possibly blowing the guru game by revealing his inner doubts to George.
I wish I could give them a chance to surrender.
You don't want them too close when they go,
said Howard.
Are your people out of the way?
Hagbard asked in agony.
Of course,
the dolphin replied irritably.
Quit hesitating. This is no time to be a humanitarian.
The sea is crueler than the land,
Hagbard protested, but then he added,
sometimes.
The sea is cleaner than the land,
Howard replied. Hagbard tried to focus. The dolphin was obviously aware of his distress, and soon George would be. No, a quick probe showed George had retreated from the scene into the past and was shouting,
"You silly sons of bitches!"
at somebody named Carlo.
These people have been your enemies for 30,000 years.
I'm not that old,
Hagbard said wearily. The demonstration had failed. He was committed, and others with him were now committed. Hagbard reached out a brown finger, let it rest on a white button on the railing in front of him, then pressed it decisively.
That's all there is to it,
he said quietly.
Be a wise ass, then. When you start flunking half your subjects, perhaps you'll come back to reality.
A voice, long, long ago, at Harvard. And once, in the South, he had been moved by a ridiculously simple fundamentalist hymn.
Jesus walked this lonesome valley. He had to walk it all alone. Nobody else could walk there for him. He had to walk it by himself. I will walk this lonesome valley,
Hagbard thought bitterly,
all by myself, all the way to Ingolstadt and the final confrontation. But it's meaningless now. Demonstration has failed. All I can do is pick up the pieces and salvage what I can. Starting with Dorn right here and right now.
Hate like molten lead drips from the wounded sky. They call it air pollution. August personage dials slowly, with the cunt-starved eyes of the medieval saint.
God lies!
Weishaupt cried in the middle of his first trip.
God is hate!
Harry Coyne is crumpled in his chair. George's head hangs at an angle like a doll with a broken spring. Stella doesn't move. They are not dead, but stoned. Abe Relis blew the whistle on the entire Murder Incorporated organization in 1940. He named Charlie Workman as the chief gun in the Dutch Schultz massacre. He gave the details proving the roles of Lepke, who was executed, and Luciano, who was imprisoned and later exiled. He kept his mouth shut about certain other things, however. But Drake was worried. He gave orders to Maldonado, who conveyed them to a capo, who passed them on to some soldiers. Relis was guarded by 5 policemen, but nonetheless he went out his hotel window and spread like jam on the ground below. There were mutterings in the press. The coroner's jury couldn't believe that 5 cops were on the take from the syndicate. Relis's death was declared to be suicide. But in 1943, as the final solution moved into high gear, Lepke announced he wanted to talk before his execution. Tom Dewey, alive by the grace of the Dutchman's death, was governor, and he granted a stay of execution. Lepke spent 24 hours with Justice Department officials, and it was announced later that he refused to reveal anything of significance. One of the officials had been brought back from state to work with Justice because of his background on Schultz and the Big Six Syndicate. He said little, but Lepke read a lot in his eyes. His name, of course, was Winifred. Lepke understood. As Bela Lugosi once said, there are worse things than dying. In 1932, the infant son of aviator Charles Lindbergh Jr. was kidnapped. Already at that time, a heist of that dimension could not be permitted in the Northeast without the consent of a full-fledged don of the Mafia. Even a capo could not authorize it alone. The aviator's father, Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., had been an outspoken critic of the Federal Reserve monopoly. Among other things, he had charged on the floor of Congress.
Under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present one is the first scientifically created one worked out as we figure a mathematical problem.
The go-between in delivering the ransom money was Jaffe Condon, Dutch Schultz's old high school principal.
It's gotta be one of them coincidences,
as Marty Crompier said later. John Dillinger arrived in Dallas on the morning of November 22, 1963, and rented an Avis at the airport. He drove out to Dealey Plaza and scouted the terrain. The triple underpass where Harry Coyne was supposed to stand when doing the job was under observation from a railroadman's shack, he noted. It occurred to him that the man in that shack would not have a long life expectancy. There would be a lot of other eyewitnesses, he realized, and the jams couldn't protect them all, not even with the help of the LDD. It was going to be bad all around. In fact, the man in the railroad shack, S.M. Holland, told a story that didn't jibe with the Earl Warren version, and later died when his car went off the road under circumstances that aroused speculation among those given to speculating. The coroner's jury called it an accident. Dillinger found his spot in the thickly wooded part of the grassy knoll and waited until Harry Coyne appeared on the underpass. He made himself relax and looked around to be sure that he was invisible from everywhere but a helicopter. There were no helicopters. The Illuminati's top double agent within the Secret Service had seen to that. A movement in the school book depository caught his eye, something not kosher up there. He swung his binoculars and caught another head ducking quickly atop the Daltex building, an Italian, very young. That was bad. If one of Maldonado's soldiers was here, either the Illuminati were aware they had a double agent in their midst and had hired 2 assassins, or else the syndicate was acting on its own. John panned back to the school book depository. Whoever that clown was, he had a rifle too, and he was being cagey. Definitely not Secret Service. This was a piss cutter. John's original plan was to plug Harry Coyne before Coyne could get a bead on the young Hegelian from Boston. Now he had 3 men to knock out at once. It couldn't be done. There was no human way of hitting more than 2 of those targets, all 3 of them in different areas and at different elevations, before the fuzz were swarming all over him. The third would have time to do the job while that was happening. It was what Hagbard called an existential koan.
Shit, piss, and industrial waste,
John muttered, quoting another Chileanism.
Well, save what you can, as Harry Pierpont always said when a bank job went sour in the middle. Save what you can and haul ass out of that place.
If Kennedy had to die, and obviously it was in the cards, or in the I Ching at least, which probably explained why Hagbard, after consulting that computer of his, refused to get involved in this caper, then save what you can could only be applied, in this case, to mean screw the Illuminati. He would give them a mystery they would never solve. The motorcade was already in front of the schoolbook depository, and the gazebo up there might start blasting at any minute, if Harry Coyne or the mafiosos weren't quicker. Dillinger hoisted his rifle, quickly sighted on John F. Kennedy's skull, and thought briefly,
Even if it falls through and doesn't remain an enigma to bug the Illuminati, think of those wild headlines when I'm caught. President shot by John Dillinger. People will think Orson Welles is publishing the papers now.
And then he tightened his finger.
Murder?
George asked.
It's hard not to think of good and evil when a man's games get that hairy.
During the Kali Yuga,
Stella replied,
almost all our games are played with live ammunition. Haven't you noticed?
The 3 shots blew brains into Jackie Kennedy's lap, and Dillinger, whirling in amazement, saw the man start to run out of the grassy knoll down into the street. John set off in pursuit and caught a glimpse of the face as the killer mingled in the crowd below.
Christ!
John said.
Him?
Stella toked again. She never seemed to think she was sufficiently stoned.
Wait,
she said.
There's a passage in Never Whistle While You're Pissing that goes into this a bit.
She got up, walking quite slowly like all potheads, and rummaged among the books on the wall shelf.
You know the old saying, different strokes for different folks?
She asked over her shoulder.
Hagbard and Fuck Up have classified 64,000 personality types, depending on which strokes or gambits they use most often in relating to others.
She found the book and carefully walked back to her chair.
For instance,
she said slowly,
right now you can intersect my lifeline in a number of ways, from kissing my hand to slitting my throat. Between those extremes, you can, let's say, carry on an intellectual conversation with sexual flirtation underneath it, or an intellectual conversation with sexual flirtation and also with kinetic signals indicating that the flirtation is only a game and you don't really want me to respond. And on an even deeper level, you can be sending other signals indicating that actually you do want me to respond after all, but you're not ready to admit that to yourself. In authoritarian society, as we know it, people are usually sending either very simple dominant signals, I'm going to master you and you'd better accept it before I get really nasty, or submissive signals, you're going to master me and I'm reconciled to it.
Lord in heaven,
Harry Coyne said softly.
That was what my first session with him was all about. I tried dominant signals to bluff him, and it didn't work. So I tried submissive signals, which is the only other gimmick I ever knew, and that didn't work either. So I just gave up.
Your brain gave up,
Stella corrected.
The strategy center for dealing with human relations in authoritarian society was exhausted. It had nothing left to try. Then the robot took over. The biogram. You acted from the heart.
But what has redundance got to do with this?
George asked.
Here's the passage.
Stella said. She began to read aloud.
People exist on a spectrum from the most redundant to the most flexible. The latter, unless they are thoroughly trained in psychodynamics, are always at a disadvantage to the former in social interactions. The redundant do not change their script. The flexible continually keep changing, trying to find a way of relating constructively. Eventually, the flexible ones find the proper gambit, and communication of a sort is possible. They are now on the set created by the redundant person, and they act out his or her script. The steady exponential growth of bureaucracy is not due to Parkinson's law alone. The state, by making itself even more redundant, incorporates more people into its set and forces them to follow its script.
That's heavy,
George said.
But I'll be damned if I can see how it applies to Jesus. Or Emperor Norton.
Exactly.
Harry Coyne chortled.
And that ends the game. You've just proven what I suspected all along. You're the Martian.
Don't raise your voices,
Gally said drowsily from the floor.
I can see hundreds of blissful Buddhas floating through the air.